Hello, this is Lynn McCool again, and this is the first set of PowerPoints for Unit 2. Today we want to consider communication models looking at teams, ethics, and access. So what is communication modeling? Well, it is used to explain the way people exchange information. You can think of it as a way to describe or illustrate communication more broadly, and it allows technical communication writers to determine the best approach for each project. Here's some terms that you should know. First of all, the source. In models of communication, a person who creates and sends a message to receivers is called a source. The message is the verbal or nonverbal ideas that a source conveys through the communication process. Encode is to choose a verbal or nonverbal symbol to organize and deliver one's message. Decode is to interpret a message by making sense of a source's verbal or nonverbal symbols. Decoding is performed by a receiver. Verbal symbols, a spoken, written, or recorded word that a source uses to convey a message. Nonverbal symbols are a means of communication without using words, and those could be things like gestures, facial expressions, eye contact, and images. Receivers are the ones who possess a message to perceive its meaning. And we also have something called noise and interference. These can be external or internal phenomena that disrupt the communication stream. External sources could include a nearby loud noise, and internal sources might include the wandering thoughts of the sender or the receiver. Finally, this idea of transaction. This is a communication exchange in which all participants continuously send and receive messages. And feedback is part of that transaction exchange. This is the audience's verbal and nonverbal responses to a source's message. So here's a simple transaction model. We have John over here, who is the sender, and he wants to send a message to Ted, which is the receiver. Ted interprets the message and provides feedback to John. John processes the message or processes the feedback and then modifies the message. In some models of communication, we have something called shared meaning, which is a common understanding with little confusion and few misinterpretations. Achieving shared meaning is a priority of both the simple model of communication as well as the interference transactional model of communication. Here's an example of an interference transaction model of communication. Unlike the simple model, which is just simply a back and forth communication stream, the interference model introduces this idea of noise and how noise affects the ability of the sender to send a message that is correctly understood by the receiver. So with the interference model, then we see that noise sometimes disrupts this idea of a shared meaning. So here's another example. John wants to send a message to Ted, the receiver, but he can't. And the reason why is because of interference. So John encodes the message by determining structure and content. Ted receives the message and then decodes it and provides some feedback. I would like to suggest that there is another model we might consider using for technical communication, and this is called the CMAP communication model. I think that this is a better model for TechCom than the simple transaction model or the interference transaction model, and let me show you why. CMAP stands for context, message, audience, purpose, and product. This model applies to technical communication by omitting the sender and receiver and transmission elements. Instead, we look at things like situations or contexts in which people find themselves and how those affect their communication stream. What people say, the message, is affected by the person or group with whom they are communicating, which is the audience. In the CMAP model, what people communicate is affected by their reason for communicating and their expectations or the purpose for communication. And the physical form of the communication, this is the product, affects the way in which the communication is formulated and received. Here's a diagram then of the CMAP model. So we have that the message affects both the audience to which the communication is directed, The purpose affects the intent of the message. The product refers to the technical document, and each element impacts and affects each other continuously. So you can see that there is actually a back and forth. This actually should have a double arrow here. So this works both ways, and you can see that there are multiple interactions that are happening. Let's also talk a little bit about ethical communication, because this also is important to our understanding of effective communication within the world of technical communication. Some key definitions here would be, first of all, ethics, which are systems of moral, social, or cultural values that govern the conduct of an individual or community. We sometimes find ourselves in something called an ethical dilemma. This is a choice among two or more unsatisfactory courses of action, and sometimes this is known as picking the lesser of two evils. Personal ethics typically are derived from family, culture, and faith. Social ethics are derived from constitutional, legal, utilitarian, and caring sources. So those could be civil and constitutional rights, or the kinds of ethics that are derived from the judicial system, so laws and corporate policies. Or they could be derived from this idea of utilitarianism, so the greatest good for the greatest number, or the majority rules, that kind of idea. Or from this idea of care, which has to do with tolerance and compassion. There is also something called conservation ethics. These are values that protect and preserve the ecosystem in which we live. Ethical dilemmas can be hard to navigate, and so I'd like to suggest some ideas about how to resolve an ethical dilemma. First of all, you'd want to find the point of ethical tension, that point where two or more ethical stances are incompatible. And a good example of this might be product liability. So a product has been created maybe to solve some sort of problem or issue, but there are problems with that product, and so there becomes then a tension, an ethical dilemma about how the product should be managed, whether it should be sold or not, and other issues that might surround it. So thinking about steps to resolving some sort of ethical dilemma, first of all, you want to think about these questions as a heuristic, in other words, as an evaluation tool to help you work through the ethical dilemma. You could ask yourself, do any laws or rules govern my decision? That's probably the first question you'd want to ask. Make sure that there aren't already constraints out there that would help to help you to create the proper response. Next, do any corporate or professional codes of ethics offer guidelines? Are there any historical records from which to learn? In other words, is there any precedents that I might look to in order to resolve this problem? What do my colleagues think, and what would moral leaders do? And then, after having thought through each of these ideas, choose to make an informed decision. Ethics also has to do with something called copyright law, and especially with technical communication, we have to be very aware of copyright law. According to copyright law, materials owned by the people who wrote or produced them are protected from unauthorized use. So consider how issues of copyright law can affect technical communication, especially if we are creating documents in which we are using images, borrowed images from other sources. We want to make sure that if we are borrowing images or ideas from other sources, that we are giving credit and that we are using those ideas and images legally. Copyright law in the United States is based upon the U.S. Constitution, and the Constitution provides a specific provision respecting copyright. And you can see that it comes from Article 1, Section 8. So Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So copyright is there to help to protect people who have original ideas and individuals who have done the hard work of inventing or coming up with things that we need or that we want to use. And so we do want to be careful in our documents that we are providing correct documentation if we are using something that is someone else's, and also if it is something that's copyrighted, that we have gained permission from the owner in order to use it. Okay, that's all I have for this section of Unit 2, and so I will visit with you again in the next PowerPoint.